By 1972, the United States was determined to make a peaceful exit from South Vietnam. We were going to slowly hand over the reins to South Vietnamese military forces to fight their battles, and we were continuously pulling troops out of Vietnam. We were not officially in a non conflict status at that point, though. Several different things had to happen. We had to negotiate our peaceful exit, but it had to be on various different terms. We had to actually talk to the North Vietnamese and include the South Vietnamese and Viet Cong in those negotiations as well. These entities would all meet in Paris so as to negotiate several different arrangements. The very first time that American, North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, and Viet Cong negotiators met, the only thing that they could agree upon was the shape of the table and where they could talk. That was it. You're not going to get real far in your negotiations when you can't agree on anything other than the seat arrangements and table arrangements. Okay? So, what does the United States do in retaliation for a lack of negotiation? We force North Vietnam's hand. You see, in 1968, the United States under LBJ decided to end various different bombing campaigns so as to reduce collateral damage in North Vietnam. You're fighting a war, okay? And you decide not to use weapons, okay? In 1972, it was determined, especially under the advice of Henry Kissinger, that the United States re-escalate our bomb so as to force North Vietnam's hand. Okay? I'd mentioned that we're no longer involved in various different troop operations that are on the offensive. We're just defending at this point. But bombing makes a very big difference. When you bomb the port of Haiphong, you bomb the port of Hanoi, various different supply chains and other aspects that directly impact North Vietnam rather. You force their hand. Okay. Now the North Vietnamese, after they've been bombed into the Stone Age, want to come back to the negotiating table in Paris. And in December of 1972, they begin negotiating. The United States agrees to pull all troops out of South Vietnam, and North Vietnam would allow peaceful exit in exchange also for a return of American prisoners of war, as many of them intact as possible. And then they brutalized almost every single one of them. That's a whole different story. In exchange for POWs and a peaceful exit, North Vietnam would get to keep the troops that they already have in South Vietnam still in Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government sees that. They're like, wait a sec. America, what are you saying? I thought you were on our side. Why are you going to let North Vietnam, who is grossly invading our country, why have we fought this war for years and years? You're just going to let them stay? Why would you negotiate to let them stay? South Vietnam obviously had a problem with the United States and North Vietnam negotiating North Vietnamese troops staying in South Vietnam. Okay. But under the terms of the Paris Accord, the United States would get its troops back, and in January of 1973, we formally announced the end to all military involvement in Vietnam. Okay? We have negotiated a peaceful exit. An exit with honor, if you will. The Americans entered into the war so as to protect democratic ideals. We fought valiantly, lost many lives, and in the end, we did our duty. We weren't successful at that point yet. Hold that thought. But that was our PR control, if you will. Okay? Dating back to the very late 1950s and early 60s, when JFK and even the Eisenhower administration had begun implementing military advisors into South Vietnam so as to thwart the communist guerrilla movement, and then eventually our escalation in Vietnam. Since those days, over 2.5 million Americans served in Southeast Asia. Over the course of our involvement, over 58,000 Americans would lose their lives as a result of the conflict in Vietnam. Over 300,000 were somehow wounded. Okay? Many Vietnam vets came back from home with ghastly wounds, missing limbs or whatnot, bullet holes. There were other things like chemical exposure, such as Agent Orange. Agent Orange is a defoliant. It's a chemical that kills plants, basically. The United States military dropped gallons and gallons and tons of gallons all over various aspects of the South Vietnamese countryside so as to defoliate dense jungle undergrowth and jungle canopy so as to help uncover the Viet Cong. There would be long-lasting effects. Many different Vietnam vets were exposed to Agent Orange and developed severe side effects over the course of the next few decades. You have many Vietnam vets coming home suffering effects from post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD. To this day, Vietnam vets still struggle with that. They struggle with having fought an invisible enemy and then fighting each other. They struggle having seen all of that while seeing their friends get blown up. And for what? Vietnam vets would also come home to a public that was very largely unwelcoming. Nowadays, especially during the Iraq War years or our involvement in Afghanistan and whatnot in the post 9/11 era, American troops going to fight overseas or serve overseas were welcomed back home. Anytime, I remember in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, 2007, when American troops would come home, there'd be big parades, there'd be people in baggage claim welcoming American troops, handing over wreaths, doing all kinds of different things. Even if people did not support the war in Iraq, and there were a lot of people who did not, they learned a lesson from Vietnam. Do not blame those who are called to serve by their country. It's the politicians who sent them there. Don't blame the troops for doing what their country asked them to do. That was one of the big lessons we learned in Vietnam. And for most Vietnam veterans, it was very bitter when American forces leave, and due to various different circumstances, which I'll detail a little bit later in future slides. Eventually, by April 1975, South Vietnam's military would collapse under pressure. They wouldn't be able to beat back communist forces. And by late April 1975, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to the North Vietnamese. And during that process, American troops, including troops and personnel at the U.S. Embassy, began a massive evacuation process, evacuating American personnel, but also evacuating thousands of South Vietnamese refugees who were deemed as perhaps being targets by communists. Okay? Former military commanders, South Vietnamese government personnel, other prominent families. There were refugee camps established all over the United States. One particularly in Arkansas was especially big, that housed South Vietnamese refugees. Folks were lifted off of rooftops in helicopters and loaded onto naval ships. Naval ships were cleared. Helicopters were dumped overboard so that South Vietnamese refugees could be placed on the tarmac. So, you have a mass evacuation. And of course, the North Vietnamese eventually take Saigon. And the next year, Vietnam, as you know it, was formally integrated. That officially put a real stain on America's involvement in Vietnam and all the people who served valiantly in that conflict. Must have been a very bitter pill for them to swallow.